Welcome back. In the previous lecture, we discussed three important concepts for supporting an argument. The first was the necessity of explaining the meaning of your evidence to your readers, of providing a clear link or connection between your proof and your claims. And as I mentioned last time, evidence does not explain itself. You'll remember the example of the prosecuting attorney presenting the murder weapon in a court case, but not bothering to explain its relevance. It's not enough to show us evidence in support of your argument. You have to show us, and then you have to tell us in no uncertain terms how that evidence is relevant. The second key point in our last lecture was to make sure that the links or the connections you forge between your evidence and your argument are not based on association or speculation or just simple correlation. This is especially crucial when your argument is relying on statistics or what we might call empirical evidence. You probably remember my pet peeve about the tendency of many writers to draw on scientific studies of caffeinated lab rats to speculate on the effects of coffee drinking on human beings. Now, while it's true that such connections, based as they are on association or correlation, can often carry some real persuasive force, their ability to sway someone's opinion is usually short-lived and not sustainable. To support a lasting, substantial, convincing argument, you need to draw clear connections between your proof and your claims. And these connections have to be direct. We can easily see how you got from A to B. They have to be definitive. They have to clearly explain how this works, and they have to be based on a cause-effect relationship. Finally, we discussed the importance of using concessions, recognizing that other people may hold different points of view than your own, and conceding that those opinions have to be acknowledged. We studied how an effective and successful writer like Thomas Paine uses concessions to actually strengthen his own argument. He presents an opposing viewpoint as a means of highlighting or calling attention to the differences between that argument and his own. And it's these differences that he then uses to underscore the strengths of his claims and the weaknesses of his opponents. So while concession might at first seem like a strategy that would undermine your argument, it really can end up strengthening it. So we saw how his use of concessions bolsters his own credibility as a writer by demonstrating how thoroughly he studied alternative arguments. And so the fact that he's done his homework, so to speak, makes his own claims that much more convincing. We're much more likely to trust the person who acknowledges counter-arguments to his own than we are the person who tries to ignore or hide counter-evidence. And I'm sure that you found yourself in a position sometimes when you're making an argument where you think, oh, if I could just ignore this counter-evidence, then it will make my argument stronger. And that's not the case. It will actually weaken it. So, in the previous three lectures, we've studied strategies for starting, organizing, and supporting arguments. And these are strategies that will make your writing more powerful and persuasive. Today, we're going to focus on methods for crafting effective conclusions. In other words, how to wrap up and finish off your presentation of an argument in ways that really solidify your claims, establish your viewpoint, make your case, and perhaps, we can hope, even leave your readers wanting to hear more of what you have to say about the issue, topic, question, or problem you've been addressing and discussing. Now, I know very well, because I have been there myself, that by the time you reach the end of a piece of writing, you're tired and you just want it to be done, so maybe you dash off a conclusion that isn't really that well thought out. And you have got to fight this impulse. If you need to go do something else and then come back to your writing in order to really focus on writing a good conclusion, then do that. Just don't neglect the end of your argument. It's the final impression. It's your final chance to make an impact on your reader. You've probably been told at some point by an English teacher or a writing instructor that conclusions have to include a summary of the highlights of your argument. So you have to reiterate points that you've already made. And those teachers and writing instructors would be correct. This is certainly true. An effective conclusion should include some sort of recap of your main ideas that have structured your argument all along. I always encourage students to touch again briefly on the main points of their arguments when they come to the conclusion. They may think that it's redundant and boring. After all, they've been writing about this thing for days, and so the conclusions seem really obvious to them. But readers who haven't been working on this thing for days are generally grateful for a short summary of what the argument is about and why it matters. And of course, the key component of this short summary needs to be a restatement or a reiteration of the main thesis of the argument, or the primary position or viewpoint you've chosen to argue for or defend in this piece of writing. If you followed the strategies we've covered in the previous 3 lectures, the basic elements of your conclusion should already be established, meaning you really shouldn't have to work too hard to formulate this summary that goes in your concluding paragraph. But at the same time, you need to take the writing of this conclusion as seriously as possible and as seriously as any other dimension or element of the writing process. Most importantly, and I can't stress this enough, you should not simply repeat verbatim, word for word, what you say in your introduction. A little variation shows that you've really thought about wrapping this argument up in a compelling and engaging way. Okay, but what else should you do with a conclusion? How can you effectively finish an argument by doing something other than or more than just summarizing for your readers the thesis and key points that you've already articulated for them throughout the rest of the piece of writing? And here again, the famous essayists we've been talking about, Payne, Thoreau, and Swift, can provide us with some concrete examples and some answers. Let's look first at Payne's final 2 paragraphs in Common Sense. And I should note here that just prior to these final paragraphs, Payne provides his readers with precisely the kind of summary or recap of his argument's key points to which I referred just a few moments ago. He actually begins his summary with the phrase, "to conclude." Now, as a general rule, I recommend not using the "to conclude" phrase, if at all possible. It's a little boring and unoriginal, but at the same time, it does make clear for your readers that they are going to get a summary of your argument. So it can be useful in terms of signposting and directing your reader to the particular portion of your writing. After his "to conclude," Payne goes on to list and restate 4 points. He says first, secondly, thirdly, fourthly. And these 4 points constitute the heart of his argument. The most important thing to keep in mind, for our purposes at least, is that Payne does not stop after he's presented his 4-point summary. He goes on to include these final 2 paragraphs, and in doing so, he raises the quality level of his conclusion from good to outstanding. Here's the first of the 2 paragraphs I want you to consider. Quote, "Under our present denomination of British subjects, we can neither be received nor heard abroad. The custom of all courts is against us, and will be so until, by an independence, we take rank with other nations." Now, as you're no doubt well aware, the main point of Payne's pamphlet is to call for the independence of the 13 colonies from Great Britain. And he's been making this point in a variety of ways throughout the essay. But just in case we miss something, he states it here in no uncertain terms and with a succinct eloquence that is truly memorable. And after this, he then moves on to his final paragraph, where he says, quote, "These proceedings may at first appear strange and difficult, but like all other steps which we have already passed over, will, in a little time, become familiar and agreeable. And until an independence is declared, the continent will feel itself like a man who continues putting off some unpleasant business from day to day, yet knows it must be done, hates to set about it, wishes it over, and is continually haunted by the thoughts of its necessity." So the strategy Payne uses is one you certainly can and should follow in crafting your own conclusions, especially as a supplement to your summary or recap of your larger argument's thesis and main points. Payne's approach in these final paragraphs is what I like to call a negative consequences conclusion. Okay, everyone store that phrase away. Negative consequences conclusion. And this means that he uses these last few lines to underscore the negative things that could happen if readers are not persuaded by his argument and fail to support his vision of governmental reform. I want to emphasize here that Payne is not using the negative consequences approach as a scare tactic. He knows that few readers, especially those who are still uncertain as to the validity of a particular argument, are likely to be persuaded by overly dramatic or apocalyptic claims. But he also knows that his audience is likely to respond if they are presented with a clear statement of what the ultimate consequences may be if they choose not to accept his argument. In other words, what we learn from Payne is that effective conclusions can underscore ultimate consequences without resorting to ultimatums. Stating ultimate consequences is more like saying, if we do not do X, then Y will happen. Whereas stating an ultimatum is like saying, you'd better do X or else Y is your fault. I offer this advice to my students whenever we discuss the tone and content of conclusions. Do not confuse ultimate consequences with ultimatums. I want them to understand, as Payne does, that ultimatums put a tremendous and needless strain on the writer-reader relationship, and such a move is likely to alienate undecided readers and close off the possibility of future discussion of an issue, problem, or question. Stating something as an explanation of ultimate consequences doesn't put your reader in as defensive a position as an ultimatum does. There's one final element of Payne's conclusion I want to touch on before we look at another example, and that element is the curiosity factor. Notice that Payne does not go into extensive detail about what the ultimate consequences will be if people are not persuaded by his argument against maintaining the status quo of British rule. He makes it clear that the consequences will be negative, but he doesn't elaborate on the degree or the type of negativity, except maybe that he suggests it will resemble the feelings of a man who has some unpleasant task to do but keeps putting it off, only to find himself dogged by the sense that he's doing himself a disservice by procrastinating. This is not a nice state of mind to find yourself in, to be sure, but it's certainly not an emotionally devastating one either. And this is, I think, a calculated move on Payne's part, and it serves as a strategy for both downplaying the difficulty of rebellion against British rule while simultaneously arousing his readers' curiosity about the matter. Following this restrained and relatively low-key approach, Payne crafts a conclusion that's meant to pique his readers' interests in other potential consequences of staying under British rule, consequences that Payne indirectly suggests he would be willing to elaborate on in subsequent written arguments. And in fact, this is what he goes ahead and does. Even if Payne's readers are not yet ready to fully accept his claims, they should be sufficiently intrigued to read whatever else he might have to say about this topic. And what writer doesn't hope that readers will want to read more of her or his work? Let's take a look at another example of an effective conclusion. And this one is from Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which we've discussed at length in some of our earlier lectures. Swift is offering a version of Payne's negative consequences approach, but he provides an extra twist. And this is a variation that I like to call the no viable alternatives. There's no other option here. Recall that Swift's satire, following the structure of classical Latin satires by writers like Horace and Juvenal, proposes this outlandish solution to a seemingly impossible problem. And in this case, the problem is pervasive poverty in Ireland, and the solution is to allow poor parents to sell their children to the rich so that the rich can eat them, so that they can provide tasty and nutritious meals. I should add that Swift is mocking both the British imperialist treatment of Ireland and this impulse among politicians and reformers of his day to suggest really simple cure-all solutions to what were complex social and economic problems. So he's criticizing that as well as the general attitude towards the Irish. In his conclusion to A Modest Proposal, Swift offers a direct challenge to those who would support these naive attempts at social engineering. And again, he does this in satiric mode, and his tongue is planted firmly in his cheek. And since he himself has just finished outlining this simple and simply ridiculous plan for fixing the problem, he then has us primed to be ready to listen to what he says next. And here it is. Quote, "I desire those politicians who dislike my overture, and may perhaps be so bold as to attempt an answer, that they will first ask the parents of these mortals whether they would not at this day think it a great happiness to have been sold for food at a year old in the manner I prescribe, and thereby have avoided such a perpetual scene of misfortune as they have since gone through by the oppression of landlords, the impossibility of paying rent without money or trade, the want of common sustenance, with neither house nor clothes to cover them from inclemencies of the weather, and the most inevitable prospect of entailing the like or greater miseries upon their breed forever." So when I say no viable alternatives, what I mean is that this strategy gives you a way in which the conclusion focuses not so much on ultimate consequences of accepting or not accepting the argument, but instead suggests that alternatives to this proposal for changing the status quo aren't workable. They aren't viable at all. Now, notice that he doesn't launch a direct attack on any particular plans that other writers have offered. Rather, he just points out that any such plans are not likely to work unless and until their authors consider the causes and implications of the problem as fully and as carefully as Swift himself has. He also offers a kind of litmus test to determine whether any alternative proposals would be as viable as his. He asked the parents of impoverished children if a particular proposed solution would be something they would choose. Swift implies that if the answer is no, then the proposal cannot be considered a worthwhile alternative to his, since his has already passed the test. Including your own version of Swift's litmus test, some criterion or standard against which alternatives to your claim or proposal have to be measured, is a powerful strategy for persuading readers that you, and not someone else, will offer the best solution or answer to the problem at hand. In essence, what you're doing is using your conclusion to establish the rules of the game, the terms for assessing the strengths and the weaknesses of any arguments other than yours that deal with the same or similar issues. And if other arguments can't measure up to yours using the standards you've set, then they can't be viewed as viable alternatives. And thus, your argument is the winner. There's one other element of Swift's brilliant conclusion that we can apply to our own work, but I want to save that for the last item of the lecture. Before we get there, I want us to look at an example from a conclusion that takes a different tone than Paine's or Swift's, because as powerful and as entertaining as their arguments can be, both Paine and Swift finish up on something of a negative note. And I don't at all want to leave you with the impression that a strong conclusion necessarily has to carry a negative tone. Now, let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that either Paine or Swift is overly pessimistic. It's clear from the larger arguments they're making that they believe their claims and proposals have the potential to really make some positive, productive change. Because really, why bother to write an essay like this unless you're actually hoping some change will occur as a result? Neither of these writers offers an especially upbeat ending to his work, and I think it's in our best interest to examine a writer who does. An argument that stresses the negative potential outcomes in its conclusion can be powerful, certainly. But one that manages to end on a hopeful note is really arguably going to be much more persuasive. I mean, I think most of us like to think of in terms of, if I follow the suggestion of writer A, good things can happen, rather than, if I don't do what writer B says, then bad things will happen. For this example, I want to turn to Thoreau's civil disobedience and examine his final thoughts and the ways he presents them. And you recall that Thoreau's main thesis involves a dual claim, a two-part claim. First, he argues for the merits of limited government. And this is like when he insists in the opening of the essay, that government is best which governs least. The second part of his claim is that he insists on the primacy of the individual over and against any governing body. So the individual is more important than the collective or the group. And he makes this point even to the point of arguing that resistance to an unjust government is not simply an option, but is actually a kind of civic duty or an obligation on the part of the individual. Given the strength of Thoreau's critique of government intervention into the lives of individuals and his strident, strong opposition to the tyranny of the state, and this is whether it's in the form of wars against other nations or raising taxes against its own citizens, what's really intriguing to see here is how he softens his tone in the final lines of civil disobedience, and he allows himself to imagine what an ideal government might be like. And he says, "I please myself with imagining a state, at least, which can afford to be just to all men, and to treat the individual with respect as a neighbor, which even would not think it inconsistent with its own repose if a few were to live aloof from it, not meddling with it, nor embraced by it, who fulfilled all the duties of neighbors and fellow men. A state which bore this kind of fruit and suffered it to drop off as fast as it ripened would prepare the way for a still more perfect and glorious state, which also I have imagined, but not yet anywhere seen." Now, the reflective tone Thoreau takes in this conclusion in no way contradicts the main content of the argument that he's been making throughout civil disobedience. In fact, it provides a large measure of support for his claims by relying on what I like to call the positive consequences strategy, meaning he uses his conclusion to emphasize potential new possibilities for a less intrusive government, and these possibilities will go unrealized if readers fail to heed his arguments. In other words, his goal is not to point out the negative things that may occur if readers do not accept his claims, but rather he wants to underscore the fact that some potentially positive things won't happen. Thoreau also includes a dimension to his conclusion that mirrors something like what we saw in Paine's final lines. And try and think back, if you can, to Paine's final lines and see if you can recall a similarity between the two. That's right, it's the curiosity factor. Like Paine, Thoreau does not go into extensive detail about what the more perfect and glorious state he imagines is really like. He makes it clear that the consequences will be positive, but he doesn't elaborate on what those positive consequences will look like. Just as Paine makes clear that the consequences he's alluding to would be negative, he doesn't elaborate on the type or the degree of that negativity. And so what we said of Paine holds true for Thoreau as well. Even if his readers are not yet ready to fully accept his vision, they'll be sufficiently intrigued to read whatever else he might have to say about this topic. And in Thoreau's case, maybe they'll be excited to read these writings as well. Now, earlier I promised to end this lecture with one last piece from Swift's satirical argument in favor of transforming the impoverished children of Ireland into a culinary staple for the richest members of that society. And I'm sure you'll find that it was worth waiting for, not only because it's entertaining, which it is, but also because it exemplifies yet another method you can employ to make your own conclusions more effective. Here are the final lines of a modest proposal. I profess in the sincerity of my heart that I have not the least personal interest in endeavoring to promote this necessary work, having no other motive than the public good of my country by advancing our trade, providing for infants, relieving the poor, and giving some pleasure to the rich. I have no children by which I can propose to get a single penny, the youngest being 9 years old and my wife past childbearing. Here Swift sends his readers off with the assurance that he's got nothing to gain in a financial sense from his proposal. He maintains an intellectual investment in the argument, of course, and he notes his satisfaction in doing something for the broader public good, but he takes really special care to point out that no economic benefits will be forthcoming for him personally if his argument is accepted and his proposal is implemented. Swift's razor-sharp wit and the satirical edge he uses are still readily apparent. There's no question about that. But this is also a deliberate attempt to thwart any of what we might call ad hominem challenges to his writing. These would be attacks on him, on his personality. So these attacks against his character or charges that his arguments are biased due to a personal stake in the outcome aren't going to work because of what he's done here at the end. Obviously, Swift's preemptive strike is, like the rest of his argument, carried out in ironic terms. There's no chance he'd be accused of crafting such an argument in the hopes that it would be implemented and lead to a financial windfall. In other words, there's no way we could imagine that he would write such a piece and then he'd go say, "And I'll go first and sell my child to show you how profitable it can be." Still, he was correct, and his preemptive strike indicates this. He's correct in a more general sense to anticipate there's going to be some form of backlash from his readers. They may not have suspected him of plotting to pad his pocketbook, but many certainly were offended by the graphic nature of his argument, even though it's presented as a satire. So it'd be safe to say that Swift was, in fact, responding to the possibility of ad hominem attacks, just not from anyone who might seek to advance his own children as hors d'oeuvres social welfare scheme. We can glean from Swift's closing lines an important reminder and a striking example of how conclusions can be used to anticipate and refute in advance charges that an argument for some broader goal or cause is actually self-serving. Now, you don't have to follow Swift's over-the-top style, but we shouldn't hesitate to emulate the spirit of his conclusion when we perceive that some similar possibility of a personal attack will follow in the wake of us making our own arguments. Okay, so what things should we take away from this final lecture in our 4-part series on crafting successful arguments? Well, I can't stress enough the importance of using the conclusion to recap the main thesis and key points of your argument. But I would also strongly encourage you to go beyond a basic summary and explore the 3 strategies we've covered here today. Those are, as you remember, the negative consequences approach used by Payne, the no viable alternatives model, which Swift gave us, and the positive consequences model, which Thoreau used. I'd also urge you to think about ways of using conclusions to pique your readers' curiosity, to get them interested, as Payne and Thoreau do. How they touch on consequences without going into extensive detail as a means of enticing readers to consider other arguments they might have to offer. And finally, I hope you'll always be mindful of the possibility that you may need to use a conclusion to preemptively defend yourself against critiques and challenges that would seek to undermine your claims by labeling them as, say, selfish or self-serving. If you can anticipate how someone might argue against you and what they might say, then you'd better address it head-on rather than ignore it. As Swift makes clear, conclusions are a powerful place to dilute or diffuse such attempts and turn the tide of readerly opinion in your favor. Okay, so now that you've all become experts on how to produce effective arguments, I'd like you to turn your newly critical eyes to some literary works and consider how they can help you become more engaging writers. In our next 3 lectures, we're going to focus on poetry and drama and what we can get out of having an understanding and appreciation of writing in these genres.